Clara believed her husband, Ethan, was a dying man. She had accepted the diagnosis from the esteemed Dr. Marcus Thorne with a theatrical solemnity that felt more like a performance than genuine grief. She held Ethan's hand in the pristine, white office, her touch as cool and distant as the marble floors, and promised him she would be there, through everything. Ethan, looking at his wife of 10 years, a woman whose world was built on the shimmering foundations of status, appearance, and the validation of others, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut that had nothing to do with the terminal illness he had just been diagnosed with. Because he knew something Clara and the handsome, confident Dr. Thorne did not. Within 3 months, their carefully constructed world of prestige and deception would be reduced to rubble. The diagnosis was a lie, and it was his own. The test, as Ethan had come to call it in the privacy of his own methodical mind, was a desperate, final gambit. He had watched the woman he loved transform, slowly at first, then with alarming speed, into a stranger. A woman who measured his worth not by his character or their shared history, but by his professional trajectory, which he had deliberately allowed to appear stagnant. He had endured the subtle barbs at family gatherings, the dismissive sighs when he spoke of his quiet work as a freelance financial analyst, the thinly veiled pity from her wealthy, arrogant friends. He needed to know, with absolute certainty, if there was anything left of the woman he had married. So he laid the ultimate trap, not with malice, but with the aching heart of a man preparing to amputate a part of his own soul. He had used his considerable and entirely hidden resources to orchestrate a series of falsified medical records, culminating in a referral to Dr. Thorne, a man whose reputation for ambition and a love for the finer things in life preceded him. Ethan had presented as a man of modest means with a catastrophic diagnosis. He had made himself small, vulnerable, a problem to be managed. He had held his breath, waiting to see if his wife would hold him close or cast him aside. He never imagined she would do both. Hey everyone, welcome. We're about to dive deep into this one, and trust me, it's a journey. I'm glad you're here for it. If you enjoy stories about the masks people wear and the moment they finally come off, you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And just for fun, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. All right, let's get back to it. The storm is just beginning to gather. The first week after the diagnosis was a masterclass in performative care. Clara fluttered around their large, minimalist house, a house she had decorated and considered her domain, with an air of tragic nobility. She made him green juices he didn't need, and spoke in hushed, gentle tones that felt more condescending than comforting. She would sit by his side on the sprawling white sofa, scrolling through her phone, occasionally patting his hand and saying, "Just rest, darling. Don't you worry about a thing." But Ethan, a man whose profession was to see the patterns beneath the surface, saw everything. He saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes when he asked for a glass of water. He saw how her shoulders tensed when he spoke of the future, even in the most abstract terms. He saw that her grief was not for him, but for the inconvenience his impending death represented. It was a disruption to the aesthetic of her perfect life. His mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, was worse. A woman carved from the same block of polished granite as her daughter, Eleanor visited under the guise of offering support, but her presence was a constant, suffocating judgment. She would walk through the house, her eyes scanning every surface, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. "Clara, darling, you must be exhausted," she'd say, completely ignoring Ethan, who sat in the armchair, a book resting unread in his lap. "This is all just so draining for you, to have to manage everything." The implication was clear. Ethan was no longer a partner, a son-in-law, a man. He was everything, a burden, a messy, unfortunate piece of administrative work that was draining her daughter's precious energy. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, Ethan was sitting in the living room, a simple, worn leather portfolio resting on the table beside him. It was old, something he'd had since his university days, and it contained nothing but blank paper. Yet he kept it close. It was a symbolic object, a quiet reminder of the power he held in reserve. Clara and Eleanor were in the kitchen, their voices carrying clearly into the open-plan space. They thought he was napping. "Honestly, I don't know how you're doing it," Eleanor said, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "The medical bills are going to be astronomical. Marcus was telling me—" She trailed off. Marcus. She was already calling Dr. Thorne by his first name. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the page of his book, but his entire being was listening. "Marcus has been a rock," Clara replied, and the warmth in her voice was a stark, painful contrast to the cool tolerance she showed Ethan. "He's been so understanding. He's helping me navigate the insurance, the estate planning, all the grim details." Estate planning. They were already planning his estate. A bitter, silent laugh caught in Ethan's chest. His estate, as far as they knew, consisted of a modest savings account and his share of the house. A house he had secretly purchased outright with cash from an early, explosive tech investment before he'd even met Clara, though he had allowed her to believe they shared a crushing mortgage. "He said it's important to be practical," Clara continued. "He said that emotional attachments can't get in the way of securing my future." There it was, the cold, hard calculus of her heart, laid bare. His death was a problem of logistics, and her future was a project to be secured. The woman he had vowed to love and cherish was discussing the management of his death with another man as if he were a failing business to be liquidated. He closed his eyes, not in pain, but in grim confirmation. The test was over. He had his answer. Now the real work would begin. He reached out and let his fingers rest on the soft, worn leather of the portfolio. Soon, it would no longer be empty. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet observation and escalating humiliation. Ethan played the part of the fading patient with a stoic grace that Clara and her mother mistook for weakness. He would shuffle to the kitchen in the morning, his movements deliberately slow, and watch as Clara, already dressed in expensive athletic wear, would give him a brief, pitying smile before heading out for a run or a yoga class. "I need to keep my strength up," she would say, a mantra that was clearly for her benefit, not his. "For you." But Ethan knew she was really fortifying herself for a life without him, a life she was already beginning to build. Her phone, once a source of shared jokes and plans, was now a guarded fortress. It buzzed and chimed with messages she would read with a small, private smile, angling the screen away from him. Ethan didn't need to see the name to know who it was from. The calls from Dr. Thorne became more frequent. Initially, they were framed as professional check-ins. "Marcus just wanted to see how your symptoms were today," Clara would announce, her voice brittle with false concern. But soon the pretense thinned and then vanished altogether. She would take the calls in another room, her laughter echoing down the hallway, a sound he hadn't heard directed at him in years. One evening she came home late, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. She smelled of expensive wine and a cologne that was not his. She found him in the study, the leather portfolio open on the desk before him. He was sketching, an old hobby, drawing the intricate structures of buildings from memory. It was a mental exercise that calmed his strategic mind. "Oh, you're still up," she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and annoyance. She leaned against the doorframe, a picture of careless beauty. "I was out with a few of the girls. We were talking about setting up a fundraiser. For rare disease research, you know. In your honor." The lie was so audacious, so insulting, it was almost magnificent. A fundraiser in his honor. A social event to launder her affair into an act of public charity. Ethan looked up from his sketch, his expression unreadable. "That's very thoughtful of you, Clara," he said, his voice even. "Which girls?" The question was simple, a small test of her composure. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it over. "Oh, you know, Amanda, Jessica, the usual crowd." Amanda and Jessica were in Europe, a fact he knew from their incessant social media posts. He had seen a picture of them in front of the Eiffel Tower that very afternoon. He simply nodded, letting the lie hang in the air between them, a toxic, invisible cloud. "Well, that's nice," he said, and returned to his drawing. Her relief was palpable. She thought she had gotten away with it. She saw his quiet acceptance not as a sign of his dignity, but as proof of his defeat. He was too sick, too weak, too diminished to challenge her. This was her fatal miscalculation. She was so blinded by her own arrogance and his apparent decline that she couldn't see the man in front of her for what he was. A judge, patiently gathering evidence for a trial only he knew was coming. The next day, Ethan made a call. He used a secure, encrypted line from a burner phone he had purchased weeks ago. The voice on the other end was sharp, familiar, and loyal. "David Chen speaking." "David," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's me. It's time." There was a pause, then a heavy sigh from his old university roommate, now one of the most feared forensic accountants and corporate lawyers in the country. "Ethan, I was hoping you wouldn't have to make this call," David said. "How bad is it?" "Worse than we anticipated," Ethan replied, his eyes drifting to a framed photo on the wall from his wedding day. He and Clara were smiling, their faces filled with a hope that now seemed like a cruel joke. "The emotional rot is comprehensive, and I believe it's coupled with financial malfeasance. Dr. Thorne's practice. I need you to start digging, quietly." "Consider it done," David said, his tone shifting from friendly concern to professional precision. "I'll need access to your private servers and the initial file you compiled on him." "I'm sending it now," Ethan said, his fingers flying across a second, hidden laptop. "Look for irregularities in his billing, especially with elderly patients. Look for connections to pharmaceutical companies, anything that suggests kickbacks or unethical trials. The man's ambition is a liability. Use it." "And Clara?" David asked, his voice softening slightly. "What's the protocol for her?" Ethan looked at the wedding photo again. For a moment, a wave of genuine sorrow washed over him. The ghost of the woman he loved still lingered in this house, in his memory. But the woman who lived here now was a stranger. "Monitor her spending," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "Track all transfers, all new accounts. She's planning for a future. I want to know exactly what that future is built on." "Understood," David said. "Stay safe, Ethan, and remember what we're dealing with." "I know," Ethan said, his gaze falling once more on the simple leather portfolio. "I'm counting on it." He ended the call and sat in the silence of the study. The game had changed. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was now an active hunter, and the trap he had set for his wife was about to become far more intricate and far more inescapable than she could ever imagine. The humiliation he had endured was no longer just a source of pain. It was fuel, and the fire was just getting started. The next few weeks were a descent into a surreal kind of psychological warfare. Clara, emboldened by Ethan's passivity, grew more brazen. Dr. Thorne, or Marcus, as he was now exclusively known, became a regular presence in their home. He would arrive with his black leather doctor's bag, a prop that seemed to grant him sanctimonious entry, and perform a cursory checkup on Ethan. The checkups were a farce. Marcus would press a cold stethoscope to Ethan's chest, his eyes meeting Clara's over Ethan's head, a silent, smug communication passing between them. "His heart rate is a little elevated," Marcus would say, his voice laced with a patronizing tone. "But that's to be expected. The body is under tremendous stress." Ethan would simply lie there, meeting the doctor's gaze with a placid emptiness that Marcus interpreted as the vacant stare of a man succumbing to his fate. Ethan, however, was cataloging. He noted the brand of Marcus's outrageously expensive Swiss watch, the custom-tailored suit that whispered of wealth far beyond a typical cardiologist's salary, the subtle scent of Clara's perfume on his collar. He was a walking, talking collection of red flags, and Ethan was diligently taking note of every single one. After these examinations, Marcus would stay for dinner. He and Clara would sit at the long, polished dining table, drinking expensive wine that Ethan had paid for, discussing their plans. They spoke about travel, about renovations to the house, about a future that was vibrant and exciting. They spoke as if Ethan were not even in the room, a ghost at his own feast. One evening was particularly brutal. They were seated at the dining table, the remains of a lavish meal, catered of course because Clara was too overwrought to cook, spread before them. Ethan had eaten little, pushing the food around his plate to maintain the illusion of a man with no appetite. Clara, swirling a deep red Cabernet in her glass, sighed dramatically. Marcus, I just don't know what I'm going to do about the finances. With Ethan unable to work, everything falls on me. The mortgage, the upkeep on this place, it's a fortress. This house is an asset, Clara, not a liability, Marcus said smoothly, placing his hand over hers on the table. It was a gesture of ownership, a public claiming. Once the estate is settled, you'll be in a much more liquid position. We can sell this place, find something more, us. A penthouse downtown, perhaps. Less memory, more view. Ethan felt a muscle twitch in his jaw, but his expression remained unchanged. His house. The house he had designed in his mind for years before he could afford to build it. The one place on earth he considered his sanctuary. They were discussing selling it off like a piece of used furniture. But that could take months, Clara lamented. The probate, the legal fees, it's all so sordid. Perhaps not, Marcus said, lowering his voice. I've been speaking with my lawyer. There are ways to expedite things. A durable power of attorney, for instance. If Ethan were to sign over control of his financial affairs to you now, it would make the transition seamless. Ethan looked from Clara's suddenly hopeful face to Marcus's predatory smile. This was their play. They were trying to get him to sign his own financial death warrant. He felt the cold, sharp clarity of pure fury, but he banked it, storing it away with the other grievances. He needed to let them play their hand. That seems practical, Ethan said, his voice deliberately weak. He saw the flash of triumph in their eyes. They thought he was folding. I'm very tired, though. Can we discuss it tomorrow? Of course, darling, Clara said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. You just rest. Later that night, as he lay in the guest room, Clara had insisted he move there so she could get a full night's sleep without worrying about disturbing him. Ethan was on a conference call with David Chen. The room was dark, the only light coming from the screen of his encrypted laptop. They're making a move for power of attorney, Ethan said. They're getting impatient. That's because they're getting nervous, David's voice crackled back. My team found it, Ethan. It's bigger than we thought. Dr. Thorne is the primary physician for a private, high-end, long-term care facility. Serenity Meadows. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? I can imagine, Ethan said grimly. He's been systematically overdiagnosing wealthy elderly patients with degenerative conditions. He gets them to sign over their estates to a trust he controls, in exchange for premier lifelong care. Then he puts them on aggressive, life-shortening medication regimens under the guise of palliative treatment. He's not just a fraud, Ethan. He's a ghoul, preying on the vulnerable. A chill went down Ethan's spine. This was darker than he had ever imagined. He had thought Marcus was just a greedy, arrogant cheat. This was monstrous. What about Clara? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is she involved in that? No, thank God, David said. Her brand of avarice is more pedestrian. She's been systematically draining your joint accounts into a new one, opened in her maiden name. Standard procedure for a gold digger. But here's the kicker. 2 days ago, she made a significant investment. She bought a 15% stake in a holding company. Ethan waited, his heart pounding. What's the company? It's the parent company of Serenity Meadows, David said. Marcus brought her in. He's not just her lover, Ethan. He's made her his business partner. The air left Ethan's lungs. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just about leaving him for another man. She had seen what Marcus was doing, seen this horrifying business model of death and theft, and she hadn't run in terror. She had invested. She had looked at a machine that consumed the elderly and stripped their families of their inheritance, and she had seen an opportunity. The last, lingering ember of love he held for her was extinguished in that moment, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. There could be no more mercy. This was not about a broken heart anymore. This was about justice. David, Ethan said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. Draw up the documents, all of them. The injunctions, the asset freezes, the evidence portfolios for the district attorney and the medical board. And book a conference room for Friday at 5 p.m., a big one. Who should I invite? David asked. Everyone, Ethan said, closing the laptop. I'm calling a family meeting. The quiet before the storm was the most unnerving part. For 2 days, Ethan moved through the house like a phantom, his silence and compliance reaching new heights. He agreed to everything. He told Clara he would be happy to meet with her and Marcus on Friday evening to finalize the paperwork for the power of attorney. He saw the predatory gleam in her eyes, the triumphant smirk she shared with Marcus over the phone. They believed they were days away from possessing everything he had. Their arrogance made them sloppy. They spoke more openly in front of him, their conversations filled with casual cruelty and giddy anticipation. They discussed selling his car, a vintage Porsche he had lovingly restored himself. They debated which of his books to keep and which to donate. They were dividing the spoils before the battle was even over, utterly blind to the fact that they were marching into a perfectly laid ambush. On Thursday afternoon, a courier delivered a large, elegant box to the house. It was addressed to Clara. She opened it with a squeal of delight. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a stunning evening gown of deep emerald silk. The card, written in Marcus's ostentatious script, read, "For our new beginning, wear it Friday, M." Clara held the dress up against herself, twirling in front of the hall mirror. "Isn't it exquisite, Ethan?" she asked, glancing at him. He was sitting in his usual armchair, the leather portfolio on his lap. He looked at the dress, then at her face, shining with a greedy, thoughtless joy. "It's a beautiful color on you," he said, his voice a quiet monotone. He was not looking at the dress. He was looking at her, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No pain, no anger, not even pity, just a vast, cold emptiness. He was looking at a complete stranger, a woman whose soul had been hollowed out and filled with cheap, glittering trinkets. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of the study, the 2 laptops open before him. On one screen was a live feed of David Chen's team finalizing the legal documents. On the other was a complex web of financial data, a stark, damning map of Clara and Marcus's crimes. He methodically went through every transaction, every email, every piece of evidence, cross-referencing and annotating. It was the kind of deep, forensic work he secretly excelled at, the work Clara had always dismissed as boring spreadsheets. These boring spreadsheets were about to become the hammer that would shatter their world. Around 3 a.m., an email from David chimed softly. The subject line was simple: "Ready." Attached was a single, password-protected file. Ethan typed in the code, "Integrity." The file opened, revealing dozens of perfectly prepared documents, injunctions, asset seizure orders, a formal criminal complaint to be filed with the district attorney's office, a comprehensive report for the state medical board, a press release for the financial journals. It was a digital arsenal, polished and lethal. He spent the next hour drafting a single-page summary. It was a list, concise and brutal. A list of grievances, betrayals, and crimes. He printed it out and slipped it into the front pocket of the old leather portfolio. Then he shut down the laptops, cleared every trace of his activity, and walked through the silent house. He paused in the doorway of the master bedroom. Clara was sleeping soundly, a small, satisfied smile on her face. The emerald dress was laid out on a chaise lounge, shimmering faintly in the moonlight, waiting for the celebration that would never come. He felt a fleeting, ghostly pang of what they once had, a memory of a different woman, a different life. But it was like remembering a character from a book he'd read long ago. The story was over. He closed the door softly. Friday arrived, a cool, crisp autumn day. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Clara was in a state of high excitement, humming as she had her hair and makeup professionally done at the house. She had told Ethan that they were having a small dinner party after the meeting to celebrate. Just a few of our closest friends, she'd said, to rally around us. He knew it was meant to be a victory party. Marcus arrived at 4:30 p.m., looking like a magazine advertisement for success. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, and he greeted Clara with a proprietary kiss that he didn't bother to hide from Ethan. "You look breathtaking," he said to her, his eyes sweeping over the emerald gown. He then turned to Ethan, who was dressed simply in a gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. "Ethan," Marcus said, his smile thin and condescending. "Ready for our little chat?" "I'm ready," Ethan said, picking up the worn leather portfolio from the hall table. The three of them drove in Marcus's gleaming black Mercedes to the downtown office building where David Chen had booked the conference room. It was a temple of corporate power, all glass and steel and polished stone. As they rode the silent, high-speed elevator, Clara smoothed down her dress, her reflection beaming back at her from the mirrored walls. "This is for the best, you know," she said to Ethan, as if trying to convince herself. "It takes all the pressure off you. You won't have to worry about a thing." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm counting on it." The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor. The receptionist led them down a long, carpeted hallway to a pair of large oak doors. "The main boardroom is ready for you," she said. Clara and Marcus exchanged a look of smug satisfaction. The main boardroom. It suited their sense of importance. Marcus pushed open the door, and Clara swept in ahead of him, ready for her moment of triumph. And then she stopped dead. The room was vast, with a panoramic view of the city skyline at dusk. But it wasn't empty. Seated around the enormous mahogany table were not just one lawyer, but four. At the head of the table sat David Chen, his expression as hard and unyielding as granite. To his left sat two grim-faced individuals Ethan recognized from David's files as senior litigators from the district attorney's office. To his right sat a stern-looking woman, Dr. Alana Reed, the head of the State Medical Board's Ethics Committee. And standing quietly by the window, looking pale and shaken, was Eleanor Vance, Clara's mother. Clara's triumphant smile dissolved, replaced by a mask of pure confusion. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Who are all these people?" Marcus's confident demeanor faltered. He looked from the DA's litigators to Dr. Reed, his face draining of color. He recognized her. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by the first flicker of raw, animal fear. "Please have a seat," David Chen said, his voice echoing in the silent room. He gestured to the two empty chairs directly opposite him. They were the only chairs left, the seats of the accused. Ethan walked past Clara and Marcus, who were frozen in the doorway. He moved to the head of the table and stood beside his friend. He placed the old leather portfolio on the polished mahogany surface. The soft thud it made seemed to shake the entire room. He looked at his wife, at her beautiful, confused face, at the emerald dress that was supposed to be for a celebration, and he began. "Thank you all for coming," Ethan said, his voice calm, clear, and resonant with a power no one in that room, save for David, had ever heard from him. "Clara, Marcus, you were expecting to discuss a power of attorney today. You were expecting me to sign over my life's assets to you. You were expecting me to fade away quietly." He paused, letting his words sink in. He looked directly at Clara. "You thought I was a dying man. You thought I was weak. You thought I was a fool." He reached down and opened the portfolio. "Let's clarify a few things." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, thick with a mixture of confusion, dread, and dawning horror. Clara stared at Ethan, her mouth slightly agape. The scene was wrong. The players were wrong. The script she had rehearsed in her mind had been torn to shreds, and she had no idea what part she was now supposed to play. Marcus stood rigid, his professional mask of calm authority cracking to reveal the panic beneath. His eyes darted from the unsmiling faces of the DA's litigators to Dr. Reed, the woman who held his entire career in her hands. Ethan let the silence stretch, a conductor holding a dramatic pause. He looked at each person in the room, his gaze finally resting on Clara. "For the last 6 weeks," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion but a chilling clarity, "I have been a guest in my own home. I have been treated not as a husband or a partner, but as an inconvenience, a financial burden to be managed and ultimately disposed of." He slid a single sheet of paper from the portfolio. It was the list he had typed the night before. "You said, Clara, at dinner 2 weeks ago, that the house was a fortress and a liability. You and Marcus discussed selling it to buy a penthouse, something with less memory, more view. You were so eager to erase me." He glanced at Eleanor, whose face was a pale, terrified mask. "You, Eleanor, told your daughter that I was draining her. You reinforced the idea that my life was a chore." He then turned his gaze to Marcus. "And you, doctor, you held a stethoscope to my chest and lied to my face, all while sleeping with my wife and plotting to steal my assets. You coached her on estate planning and advised her to secure a power of attorney to make the transition seamless. Your word." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to object, but David Chen held up a hand, silencing him with a single, sharp gesture. "The first thing you need to understand," Ethan continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more powerful in its quiet intensity, "is that the foundation of your entire plan is a lie." He paused again, letting the weight of the moment build. "I'm not sick. I'm not dying. I have never been sick. The diagnosis, the medical records, the symptoms, all of it was a fabrication, a test." A collective gasp went through the room. Clara's face crumpled in disbelief. "What? No, that's impossible." "Marcus," she turned to the doctor, her eyes pleading. But Marcus was staring at Ethan, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. The patient he had marked for death, the fool he was about to fleece, was standing before him, radiating vitality and control. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it inverted with the force of a seismic event. "A test?" Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. You lied to me?" "Did I?" Ethan countered, his voice like ice. "Or did I simply create a scenario that would reveal the truth of who you are? A truth you have been showing me for years, but that I was too foolish or too in love to accept. You failed the test, Clara. You failed it in ways I could never have imagined." He slid a second document across the table. It was a bank statement. "You were concerned about finances, about the crushing mortgage. There is no mortgage, Clara. I paid for the house in cash 5 years before we met. It is one of several assets held in a private trust, a trust you have never been aware of, because I believed a marriage should be built on love, not on a balance sheet." He then looked at Marcus. "I believe my net worth, which you were so eager to get your hands on, is currently valued at slightly over $94 million. It seems your due diligence was rather poor." The number hung in the air, stunning Clara into a new level of speechlessness. 94 million. The man she had dismissed as a professional failure, The man she was trading in for a perceived upgrade was wealthier than she could have ever dreamed. The emerald dress suddenly felt like a cheap costume. "But this is no longer about my money or your betrayal," Ethan said, his tone hardening into something dangerous. "This has become about your crimes." He tapped the portfolio. "David?" David Chen stood, all predatory grace. He addressed the DA's litigators. "Gentlemen, in this portfolio you will find evidence of a systematic scheme of fraud and medical malpractice perpetrated by Dr. Marcus Thorne. We have sworn affidavits from the families of 12 former patients of the Serenity Meadows Care Facility. We have records of falsified diagnoses, improper medication schedules, and asset transfers into a trust controlled by Dr. Thorne." He then slid a file toward Dr. Reed. "Dr. Reed, you will find a complete record of these abuses, along with evidence of kickbacks from 2 pharmaceutical companies for prescribing their most aggressive and high-risk medications. It is, by any definition, career-ending." Marcus sank into his chair, his face ashen. The bravado, the charm, the arrogance, it all bled out of him, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Finally, David Chen turned to Clara. "And for you, Miss Vance," he used her maiden name, a deliberate, cutting blow, "we have a different matter. You recently invested a significant sum into the parent company of Serenity Meadows, an investment made with funds illegally transferred from a joint marital account." Clara flinched as if struck. You knowingly bought into a criminal enterprise," David continued, his voice relentless. "While you may not have been involved in the medical aspect, you are now a partner in a company that is under active investigation for felony fraud, conspiracy, and, in at least 3 cases, negligent homicide." The room fell silent once more. The only sound was the faint, choked sob that escaped from Eleanor's lips. Clara stared at the documents, at the grim faces of the lawyers, at the man she had called her husband. The man who had, with quiet, terrifying precision, orchestrated the complete and total destruction of her entire world. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice broken. "Why would you do this?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw not the placid, weak man she had taken for granted, but the brilliant, ruthless strategist he had always been. "You asked me to sign a power of attorney," he said softly. "You wanted to make the transition seamless. So I did. I took all the power. I am simply transitioning you out of my life. Seamlessly." The immediate aftermath was chaos condensed into a suffocating silence. Clara sat frozen, her mind refusing to process the sheer scale of the catastrophe. The words, felony fraud, conspiracy, negligent homicide, echoed in the boardroom, each one a hammer blow against the fragile glass of her reality. She looked at Marcus, seeking an ally, a partner in this nightmare, but he was gone. The confident, charming doctor had been replaced by a cowering man, his face buried in his hands, mumbling, "No, no, no." He was no longer a rock, he was rubble. Dr. Alana Reed from the medical board was the first to act. She stood, her face a mask of cold fury, and looked down at Marcus. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness, "you will surrender your medical license to my office by 9 a.m. Monday morning, pending a full board review. I suggest you retain competent legal counsel. You will need it." She didn't wait for a response. She collected the file David had given her and walked out of the room without a backward glance. The 2 litigators from the district attorney's office were next. They stood, their movements calm and methodical. One of them addressed David. "Mr. Chen, your evidence is comprehensive. We will be in touch tomorrow to arrange formal depositions." "Dr. Thorne," he said, his gaze shifting to Marcus, "I would advise you not to leave the state." With that, they too were gone, leaving a vacuum of dread in their wake. Now it was just them, Ethan, David, Clara, Marcus, and the weeping Eleanor. Clara finally found her voice, a desperate, ragged thing. "Ethan, please," she began, her instincts for self-preservation kicking in. She tried to conjure the warmth, the intimacy they once shared, but it was like trying to start a fire with wet matches. "We can talk about this, just us. This is a mistake, a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, Clara," Ethan said, his voice flat. He had already moved past anger into a place of cold, objective resolution. "For 10 years I gave you my loyalty, my love, my respect. You saw it as a weakness to be exploited. You stood by and watched your mother belittle me. You flaunted your affair in my face. And when you thought I was at my most vulnerable, you and your partner here conspired not just to take my assets, but to invest in a business that profits from death. Tell me, Clara, which part of that is a misunderstanding?" His words, a calm and brutal summary of her sins, struck her silent. She had no defense. The moral mirror he held up to her was unflinching, and the reflection was monstrous. She turned to her mother, her last resort. "Mother, say something. Tell him." Eleanor looked up, her face streaked with tears. She looked at her daughter, resplendent in her emerald gown, a symbol of her greed. Then she looked at Ethan, the son-in-law she had dismissed and disdained, now the arbiter of their fate. For the first time, Eleanor saw him clearly. His quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the profound dignity he had maintained in the face of their cruelty. And in that moment, her loyalty, a thing she had always given freely and blindly to her daughter, finally fractured. "What is there to say, Clara?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "He's right. Everything he said. It's true. We did this. You did this." The betrayal from her own mother was the final blow. Clara's face crumpled, the last of her composure shattering. This was real. This was happening. Marcus finally stirred, lifting his head. The fear had been replaced by a desperate, snarling fury. "You can't prove any of this," he spat at Ethan. "This is slander. I'll sue you for everything you have." David Chen laughed, a short, sharp, humorless sound. "Sue him with what, doctor?" As of 5:15 p.m. this evening, a temporary injunction was granted, freezing all your known assets, both personal and corporate, pending the criminal investigation. The accounts for Serenity Meadows, your personal trading accounts, the trust you used to hide your stolen money, all of it is now ice. You can't afford a bus ticket, let alone a lawyer. Marcus stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He looked at Clara, his expression turning venomous. This is your fault. You and your pathetic, dying husband." "He's not dying," Clara choked out. "He was never sick." The realization seemed to hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Ethan, at his calm, healthy face, and he finally understood the depth of the trap he had walked into. He had been played, from the very beginning, by the man he had dismissed as a witless victim. "It's time for you to leave," Ethan said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He gestured toward the door. Marcus, defeated and utterly broken, stumbled to his feet. He gave Clara one last look of pure hatred before staggering out of the room, a ruined man walking toward a ruined future. Now only Clara and Eleanor remained. Clara stood up, her movements stiff. The emerald dress, once a symbol of her triumphant future, now felt like a shroud. "So that's it?" she said, her voice hollow. "You destroy my life, and that's it?" "I didn't destroy your life, Clara," Ethan said softly. "I just stopped enabling you to destroy mine. The consequences are your own creation." He picked up his leather portfolio. "David will be in touch with your lawyer, assuming you can find one to take your case, to discuss the terms of the divorce. I will be fair, but I will not be generous. As for your investment in Serenity Meadows, you are on your own." He walked to the door, David following him. He paused and looked back at Eleanor. "Eleanor, I am sorry you were caught in this. My fight was not with you." He then looked at Clara one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness. Goodbye, Clara. And then he walked out, closing the door on his past and leaving her alone in the ruins of the life she had so carelessly thrown away. The days that followed were a cascade of consequences, each one falling with the grim inevitability of a domino chain. The story of Dr. Marcus Thorne, the celebrated cardiologist turned ghoulish predator, exploded across the city's news outlets. David Chen's perfectly timed press release ensured the narrative was controlled from the start. It wasn't a messy he said, she said. It was a damning indictment backed by irrefutable evidence. Marcus became a pariah overnight. His face was plastered on television screens and newspaper front pages. The hospital where he was a senior partner terminated his privileges immediately, issuing a public statement denouncing his abhorrent and unethical behavior. His wealthy patients, once his friends and confidants, abandoned him, their terror of being associated with him palpable. The state medical board fast-tracked his hearing, and his license was permanently revoked in a public and humiliating proceeding. The criminal charges followed swiftly. He was arrested at his multi-million-dollar condo, a property now seized by the state, and led away in handcuffs, the image of his downfall captured for the world to see. For Clara, the consequences were quieter, but no less devastating. Her name was linked to Marcus's in the initial reports as an investor of interest. That was all it took. Her world, built on the fragile scaffolding of social standing, collapsed. The friends who had once flocked to her parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations dried up. Her calls went unanswered. The fundraiser in Ethan's honor she had been planning became a bitter joke, whispered in the circles she once dominated. She was no longer a tragic wife or a savvy businesswoman. She was a ghoul's accomplice, tainted by his crimes. The financial vice tightened mercilessly. The injunction froze not only her secret account, but also every joint credit card and line of credit. The income she had come to see as her right was gone. The emerald dress, a dress she could no longer afford, hung in her closet like a mocking ghost. She was trapped in the fortress of a house that was no longer hers, with no money and no one to call. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ringing of a phone that was never for her. She tried to fight. She hired a lawyer, a second-rate ambulance chaser who demanded a hefty retainer she couldn't pay. He made blustering threats to the media, which only served to produce a second wave of negative press. He tried to paint Ethan as a vindictive, manipulative monster who had entrapped an innocent woman. But the narrative wouldn't stick. David Chen had been too thorough. Ethan's quiet dignity, his 10-year history as a devoted husband, and the sheer vileness of Marcus's crimes made him an unimpeachable victim in the public eye. Clara's attempts to play the wronged party backfired spectacularly, painting her as delusional and unrepentant. About a week after the boardroom confrontation, Ethan received a call from Eleanor. Her voice was hesitant, fragile. "Ethan," she said, I need to see you, please." Ethan agreed, meeting her at a quiet cafe far from their neighborhood. She looked 10 years older. The imperious certainty was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. She didn't make excuses for Clara. She didn't ask him for anything. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "I am so sorry for everything." She spoke for nearly an hour, not just of the last few weeks, but of years of slights, of dismissive comments, of the ways she had failed to see his worth and had actively encouraged her daughter's worst instincts. "I was so focused on status, on what I thought was best for her," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you weren't ambitious enough. I didn't understand that your ambition wasn't for wealth or fame, but for integrity. I taught my daughter to value the wrong things, and I helped her become the person she is. This is my fault, too." Ethan listened, his expression calm and thoughtful. He saw in her not the antagonist from his past, but a woman grappling with a profound and genuine moral reckoning. This was not a performance. It was a confession. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. "I'm selling my house," she said, a note of resolve in her voice. "I've been speaking to some of the families from Serenity Meadows, the ones who lost everything. I'm going to use the money to help them. It's not enough. It will never be enough to fix what happened. But it's a start. It's all I can do." In that moment, Ethan's last vestiges of anger toward her dissolved. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about being forgiven. It was about the grueling, thankless work of trying to repair the damage you had caused. Eleanor was choosing that path. As for Clara, her path led only further down. Her mother's public act of contrition, reported in a follow-up newspaper article, was the final nail in her social coffin. Even her own mother had abandoned her. The divorce was swift and brutal. The prenuptial agreement, which Clara had insisted upon to protect her assets when they married — she had a small trust fund at the time — was ironclad. Ethan's hidden wealth, acquired before the marriage, was untouchable. The house was his. The cars were his. He gave her exactly what the agreement stipulated. The return of her initial trust fund, now depleted by her own spending, and a small, one-time alimony payment that was just enough to keep her from destitution, but far from the luxury she craved. She was left with nothing but the consequences of her choices. The last Ethan heard, she had moved to a small, run-down apartment across the country, trying to build a new life under a different name, forever haunted by the ghost of the fortune she had been too blind to see and the man she had been too arrogant to value. 3 months after that fateful Friday, Ethan sat in the study of his house. The space felt different now, lighter. It was no longer a stage for his humiliation, but a sanctuary once more. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the worn leather portfolio that still sat on his desk. It was a reminder, not of the battle he had won, but of the painful clarity he had gained. The test had been a terrible, desperate gamble, but it had saved him. It had excised the cancer of a false love from his life and shown him the stark, unvarnished truth. He had lost a wife, but he had reclaimed himself. He picked up a pen and a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch. Not a building this time, but a bridge. A strong, elegant structure, its foundations deep and its graceful arch reaching toward a new horizon. The storm was over. The work of rebuilding could begin. 6 months passed. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the city. The scandal of Marcus Thorne and Clara Vance had faded into old news, replaced by newer, more immediate dramas. For Ethan, life had settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. He had sold the large, minimalist house, a place too full of ghosts and painful memories. He bought a smaller, warmer home, a classic brownstone with a small garden in the back. He filled it with books, with art he loved, and with the comfortable silence of a man at peace with himself. He no longer felt the need to hide his success, but he didn't flaunt it either. He simply lived, authentically and quietly. His work continued, but he took on projects that interested him, projects that had a purpose beyond profit. He joined the board of a nonprofit that provided legal aid to the elderly who had been victims of financial fraud, his expertise now a shield for the vulnerable. He reconnected with old friends, the ones he had drifted from during his marriage to Clara. He spent weekends hiking in the mountains, the clean, crisp air a welcome antidote to the years of toxic atmosphere he had endured. He was learning to be himself again, not the diminished version Clara had demanded, but the whole, competent, and compassionate man he had always been. One afternoon, while having coffee in his new neighborhood, he saw Eleanor. She was walking slowly, her face less strained than the last time he had seen her. She was dressed simply, without the designer labels and expensive jewelry that had once been her armor. She saw him and hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small, tentative smile. He nodded back, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. There was no need for words. He knew from David that she had been true to her promise. She had sold her lavish home and established a restitution fund for the families devastated by Marcus's scheme. Her work had become her penance, and in it she was finding a new, more profound sense of purpose. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the socialite. She was just Eleanor, a woman trying to do some good in a world where she had once done so much harm. The divorce from Clara was a distant memory. He had instructed David to be firm, but not cruel. The final settlement left her with enough to start over, but not enough to replicate the life she had lost. He felt no vindictiveness, no desire for her to suffer further. Her suffering was her own creation, a prison built from her own choices. His victory was not in her downfall, but in his own liberation. He was free. One sunny Saturday, David Chen came over to the brownstone for lunch. They sat in the garden, a comfortable silence between them. "So," David said, breaking the quiet, "I got a call from a reporter yesterday, a where are they now kind of piece." "And?" Ethan asked, sipping his iced tea. "Marcus Thorne took a plea deal, 25 years. He'll be an old man when he gets out," David said. As for Clara, the reporter couldn't find her. Seems she vanished, changed her name, moved away, started over, I guess. Ethan nodded, looking at the sunlight filtering through the leaves of the old oak tree in his garden. He felt a flicker of something, not pity, not sadness, but a kind of abstract melancholy for the woman she could have been, for the love they could have had if she had chosen a different path. But it was fleeting. His focus was on the present, on the solid ground beneath his feet, on the future that stretched before him, clear and bright. "Good," Ethan said simply. "I hope she finds what she's looking for." David looked at his friend, at the peace in his eyes, the absence of bitterness. "You're a better man than I am, Ethan," he said with a wry smile. "If it were me, I'd have burned it all to the ground." "I thought about it," Ethan admitted, "but fire is indiscriminate. It destroys everything, the good, the bad, the memories of what was real along with the pain of what was false." He looked around his garden, at the new flowers beginning to bloom. "I decided I'd rather build something new." The conversation drifted to other things, to work, to travel, to the simple pleasures of a life well lived. As David was leaving, he paused at the door. "You know, that old leather portfolio is still in my office. The one you brought to the meeting. What do you want me to do with it?" Ethan thought for a moment. The portfolio had been his symbol of hidden power, the vessel for his righteous fury. But he didn't need it anymore. His power was no longer hidden. It was integrated into who he was. "Keep it," Ethan said with a smile. "A souvenir, a reminder that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should be listening to the most." David laughed. "I'll put it on my mantelpiece." After his friend left, Ethan remained in the garden as dusk began to fall. He thought about the journey of the past year, the pain, the betrayal, the cold fury, and finally the quiet, cleansing resolution. He had set a trap to find a truth, and the truth had set him free. The final chapter of this story isn't one of revenge, but of reclamation. Ethan's journey wasn't about punishing Clara and Marcus. It was about reclaiming his own life, his own integrity, and his own peace. He had faced the ultimate betrayal and had chosen not to be consumed by bitterness, but to be tempered by it, emerging stronger, wiser, and more authentically himself. He learned that true strength isn't about displaying power, but about having the quiet confidence to know your own worth, even when others refuse to see it. He learned that respect cannot be demanded or bought. It must be earned through character and action. And he learned that the most satisfying victories are not those won over others, but those won over the darkest parts of our own experiences. His story became a quiet legend among his friends, a modern fable about the dangers of arrogance and the enduring power of integrity. He never spoke of it publicly, but the lessons were woven into the fabric of his new life. He was more discerning with his trust, more appreciative of genuine connection, and more dedicated to using his skills and resources for good. He did, eventually, find love again. It wasn't a whirlwind romance built on status or appearance, but a slow-growing partnership with a woman who valued his kindness, his intellect, and his quiet strength. She was an architect, and together, they didn't just build buildings, they built a life, one based on mutual respect, shared values, and the simple, profound truth of knowing you are seen and valued for exactly who you are. The pain of his past never entirely vanished. Deep wounds leave scars, but it no longer defined him. It became a part of his history, a stark reminder of the price of blindness and the redemptive power of truth. He had walked through the fire and emerged not unscathed, but whole. So, what do we take away from Ethan's story? For me, it's a powerful reminder that our true value is not determined by the judgment of others. It's an internal measure, a quiet knowledge of our own integrity, strength, and worth. It's about having the courage to demand the respect you deserve and the wisdom to walk away from those who refuse to give it. What did you think? Was Ethan's test justified, or did he go too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's a complex moral question, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of truth, justice, and the human heart. Until next time, remember to value your own worth and never let anyone else define it for you.